Thanks everyone for joining us for this very special lunch session on gender considerations in emerging markets. It is my true pleasure to introduce our two featured speakers here on the stage, Nadia Sharon and Bethany Speer. And I'm going to introduce Nadia first to kick off this session. Nadia is a principal clean energy finance specialist at Apt Associates, where she designs and implements clean energy and infrastructure programs in Latin America and Africa. She also manages clean energy projects for the USAID-funded CEADIR activity. And prior to joining Apt Associates, Nadia worked for 9 years at the Inter-American Development Bank, first as an energy investment officer for Latin America, and then as a principal coordinator for Brazil. Previously, Nadia was the head of structured and project finance at Credit Agricole Bank in Brazil and senior vice president of energy and infrastructure finance at Santander Bank. And also, I'm briefly going to introduce Bethany. Bethany Speer manages NREL's contributions to a variety of international climate development programs and initiatives, and she has extensive experience facilitating technical assistance, capacity building, and peer learning in developing country emerging markets globally, including her leadership roles in the Clean Energy Investment Accelerator, the International Smart Grid Action Network, and the Climate Technology Center and Network. So Bethany and Nadia, thank you so much for being here with us today, and we are very excited for your insights on these issues.
Thank you so much, Michael, and I know it's lunchtime, so for the ones that joined, thank you so much for taking your lunch and eating here, and the purpose of this special session is much more to have a collaborative, interactive discussion between all of us together. So I'm gonna talk here a little bit about some of the data related to gender, mainly, and what drives business for gender in the business world. So meaning with from a business perspective, so for the bottom line revenue generation. So like Michael was saying, I work in energy. I work in energy globally. I've worked for governments, for the private sector, for multilaterals, and I think this is the right time to have this discussion. This is more and more happening, these types of discussions, and I really welcome them. Recently, I was talking on a conference that was on women in waste. It wasn't as catchy title as women in energy, but it was with the same angle. I think that when we talk about energy, one interesting factor is related to the climate scope. There was a 2014 one, I believe it was the first one. It was the ones that are published by Bloomberg, like the recent one that's outdoors. Here, it measures the investment climate for clean energy in emerging markets, and it found that the rate of growth of new energy for clean energy deployment in emerging markets was twice the size of the ones that were for OECD countries. So in terms of clean energy, this is already very relevant. And when we couple with that integrating the gender goals, we really can foment a larger discussion on the business opportunities for companies within gender and energy. So just a few data points that I think are relevant with respect to gender. First of all, gender is not women. Gender is really giving equal opportunities to both men and women. So I welcome all the men in this room that are interested in the theme. This is very, very welcoming. Just as a few data points to start, women make out about 40% of the world's workforce, but in the energy sector, women only represent 19%. And there is still a 31% gender wage gap in the energy sector. Now, some data points, a recent one by a study by IDB said that just for the LAC region, Latin American Caribbean, if women were included in the workforce, the gender gap would be null for the LAC region, this would increase the opportunity for growth for the region by $2.5 trillion. So I think in terms of money-wise, it's a very relevant theme. So when we talk about gender, energy, poverty, and the nexus, I think earlier this morning we were discussing a little bit about the challenges of the energy sector. So there's still approximately 1.1 billion people in the world that don't have access to energy or very limited access to energy, and there's still 3 billion people that rely on unsustainable biomass for cooking and heating. And at the same time, energy, as we all know, is very crucial because it is correlated to health, to education, to poverty reduction, climate change, employment, and so forth. And so when we see the size of the population of women represent 70% of the rural population. They're only 20% of the owners of the land of the world. I mean, we see that there's a lot of opportunity from a business perspective. And what is very interesting in this opportunity is that there's an untapped economic market that we can open, like I was mentioning about Latin America. But also, there's a recent study by Deloitte that says that when women have access to energy, their income level increases, a huge range, between 60 and 300% higher than their peers that don't have access to electricity. That's a very salient piece of information. In addition, girls that have access to electricity are more likely to complete primary school by about 60% as well. So these are some of the parts that are important to consider. Now, what's the opportunity for gender inclusiveness? So from a business standpoint, we see that formal and non-formal business, private sector accounts for 9 out of 10 jobs in developing countries. And companies are seeing this as a growing opportunity. And what is very important is that gender equality can have a transformative effect on productivity and growth. Why so? Because if women, who are the ones that are the primary householders and are 80% of the people that are to take the decision on access to energy or search for energy sources, if they don't have to take all of that time to look for means for cooking and heating, etc., and water as well, then this has an immediate effect because they can, what can they do with their time? If they have access to electricity, they have access to phones. So in rural areas, this enables to have immediate access to possibly for education for their children, for information via TV, for cook stove as well. So really it's interesting to see this gender lens. And of course, this is more for off-grid, but at the same time, this is where most of the energy growth is required, as we saw in the presentation by our BNEF colleague. One other point from a business perspective that's very important is this study by EY. It's a very when this number came out in 2016, it was a very important study. Because it studied women in utility. So from a general perspective, it's very hard to just segregate between off-grid and centralized power. But what it says is that they were measuring women at the top executive level. And what we see at executive boards over the last 5 years, there has not been any change worldwide over the top companies in the world that measure this. There is also not that extensive increase over for the other levels of top management for women. But one thing that is very important is that on this study, the top 20 most gender diverse utilities significantly outperform the bottom 20 with a 1.07% difference in return on equity. And 1.07 doesn't seem very important, but when you consider that these utilities are very asset-based, so they're very big in size, this has a very large economic impact. And so we know that diversity is very important at the top level in order to think about innovation and productivity. This part here, I think, is the most important one for companies because it shows what triggers companies to invest in gender diversity. So first of all, of course, like I was just mentioning, from the economic perspective, there are large business gains associated with supporting women's employment. Also, from a regulatory perspective, here I put as example the UK, because there was recently a study in the UK where the government requested that there be statistics released publicly on pay gender gaps. And besides just the numbers, what is important is that this transparency it makes it now impossible to not see what are these numbers and what are their impacts, and it's conducive to change. And the final 2 points is the government policy, if they're voluntary or required policy. And I think that Bethany will be speaking a little bit more about the ECOWAS case, but it's an extraordinary case, just to touch on very briefly. It's 15 states in sub-Saharan Africa, and within all of the initiatives that they had on regional political strategies for the energy sector, one was specifically for gender. And in 6 months' time, in 2013, I believe, these 15 countries were able to provide gender mainstreaming for energy access for these countries. And it was signed by the ministries of the 15 countries. And that's pretty impressive when we consider just here in the US to have our minister or the equivalent of Ministry of Energy just signing something so quickly related to gender. So this is a very important point. And finally, I think from a company perspective, just the mere fact of considering of marketing gender really has an impact on the investors, the business partners, and the consumers. So here specifically in this slide, it's related to one example of IBM, because when we talk about the large multinationals, generally decisions on gender are done at the corporate level, at the individual corporate level. And so IBM worked on gender diversity over a long period of time. They started with compliance with the law 30 years ago or something, and then then it was a second part, which was much more on inclusiveness and in the workforce. And then finally, they came up with this, which is really, they found from a financial perspective that diversity really pushes innovation and growth. And so it also creates a whole ecosystem for their business partners, for the clients, the suppliers, the workforce, the community, and that's the extraordinary part. Here I just put briefly a step-by-step approach. It's one by IFC, but there's a lot of other ones, which is, from a company perspective, if a company wants to get into gender, what do they do? So this is one approach. There's much more, but it's basically providing data collection, a baseline, establish your baseline, analyzing the HR policies, what is being done, identify what is the willingness of change. Then it's identify the key stakeholders and analyze employee data and business metrics, so providing also always the key metrics, and then finally disseminating the support at the top management level to really implement this gender component. Here, I'm going to go through this quickly, but there are different roles for equal gender between men and women in the renewable energy. And I would say that even more today, because there is much more need in developing countries to increase energy generation, much more training for women, capacity building, and opportunities for women to really access in the renewable energy spectrum, from both, negotiating with their communities, possibilities for renewable energy, convincing their communities for that, working also on capacity building in the sense of being the operators and to maintenance of the products themselves and market them. So there's a whole range, besides also from the policy, the regulation, being inclusive in that. And just like I was mentioning, the ECOWAS is just because it was an extraordinary, really an extraordinary event. Finally, here, I'm just going to put a few of the key energy gender inclusion measures that I think are very salient for our discussion, that I'd really appreciate participation. We'd really appreciate participation of everybody. So when it's really the part about the inclusive, already think about gender at the policy and the regulatory level. It's very important to have that in order for it to then trickle down to the private sector, the local community, the civil society. Secondly, it's about building a capacity for women, a support, a network, so that women can work not only together, but with men, and show and understand that they have a chance as well in the workforce. And one of the examples here I put is Solar Sisters. Again, it's a small example, but it's an extraordinary example because it's American women that did this initiative in Eastern Africa, in a few countries of Eastern Africa. They were investment bankers. They saw, energy is not developing fast enough. What can we do? And they created this whole women-centered direct sales network, really, to bring clean energy technology to the communities. And it's just one out of a lot of examples. I think that the two other final examples I'd like to give is to establish and implement measures and indicators for gender equity. It's a little bit what I was mentioning before, but this issue of the gender dividend, which is very key to the UN Women initiative, and partnering with donors to develop capacity building, TA, service delivery, and so forth for women. And also there is this part about the faces of energy, which is interesting as well, which is this data visualization map, stakeholder engagement on gender equality. Also it's not only to take hold of what's going on or who's doing what. It's not about policing. It's about just improving so that half of the population has access to the workforce as well, should that be of the willingness of everybody. And finally, a very important part is access to funding for energy gender inclusion. And this is very sensitive because it could be easy to consider being in the US to discuss financing options. But in other countries, the decision is not necessarily taken by the women of the household. So understanding that there are programs that are specific by multilaterals, by donors, that are really supporting women business, women in energy, and a really priority of those programs, and it is something that's extraordinary as well to have. So with that, I'm just going to stop at this moment and thank you all. And so Bethany, if you would like to just say a few notes, that would be wonderful then. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Nadia. That was a fascinating presentation. I think you really touched on all the key topics in terms of kind of key drivers and opportunities. So I'll try to follow on that a little bit with just more of a regional specific example. And this comes from NREL's experience serving as the operating agent for the Clean Energy Solutions Center. So we partnered with several other development organizations to work with ECOWAS, and specifically the Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency, to develop the gender policy that Nadia mentioned. So we started that effort by really taking a deep dive and looking at those countries and assessing kind of the gender and energy status quo. And then based on that, worked with the partner group to develop a policy, develop an implementation plan, and ultimately, as Nadia mentioned, that has been adopted by all the ministers, and now it's awaiting implementation through national policies. So some of the key findings from that very regional specific study really align with what Nadia mentioned. So there seems to be a lack of opportunity for equal wages. Women have fewer options in terms of occupational choices. And where they are working, it tends to be in less capital-intensive subsectors, it tends to be less profitable, and utilizing less advanced technology. And of course, this gender gap is exacerbated in STEM as well. Women also have less access to financing, largely explained by lower wealth, income, and schooling. And then there are also land access issues and issues in terms of accessing finance, getting approval to open a bank account, and that type of thing. So once these laws are passed nationally, there will be a training effort to really help the private sector understand what these policies mean and to help developers and project investors comply. Some key elements of this directive, and I'm picking out the things that are sort of most directly tied to the private sector. It's a broad policy encompassing a lot of different areas, but depending on how projects are assessed, energy access projects specifically, they may be required to do some studies on gender impacts and develop monitoring plans and develop indicators for tracking impacts and reporting on those. So beyond the ECOWAS initiative, a few other examples of types of policies include, occupational safety standards, so making personal protective equipment appropriate for all genders, mandating social and gender considerations to be included in the calculus for grid extension planning, also including that in energy pricing policies. That would be interesting. And it could be included in consideration for bilateral concession investment contracts. And I think, it's important to consider what's going on in emerging markets, but also what we can do here in the U.S. so that we are walking the talk and serve as good examples. So a few kind of more, local examples. So there's also the C3E program, which is also under the Clean Energy Ministerial, and that works to identify women leaders in kind of mid-career. It develops mentorships, they do symposiums, they do also global outreach through social media. And one other example, kind of building on the finance and investment and opportunity approach, so there was recently announced efforts to design a new blended capital facility that's a $100 million fund that will focus on financing services and products that have a gender component, and it could include SME financing, affordable housing, education, and income. And that will focus on investments in sub-Saharan Africa, Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia. So with that, I conclude my additional examples, and I think we could open it up to hearing from others about your experience or ideas.
I'm going to let Michael have lunch for once, so she can relax a few minutes before starting again as a moderator. So this is a little bit, we didn't want this to really be something formal, but given the possibilities of the rooms that we had, we wanted just to have actually a table and just to sit down and have a discussion. But given the format of this room, we thought it would be best that we first discuss a few of our findings and our experience working in this field. And again, it would be very interesting if if anybody is interested in providing any comments or questions or their own experience on it or how their companies work on gender or some knowledge on that. If anybody has any questions or comments.
Say something. Yes. Perfect. Here you
Good.
go.
We're not being recorded.
Are we recorded?
I don't know. There's this. Both of you, thank you so much. I think that overview is really great. One, to the organizers here, I think I'm a little disappointed that this is happening during the lunch hour and it's optional. So if we're really going to be talking about gender as an issue and needing to be mainstreamed throughout the work that we do in the sector, it shouldn't be happening while everybody's eating lunch and most people aren't here. So for example, I counted approximately 20% of women in the room today. And of those today, I would say 8 of them work either in the public sector or on public contracts. There's very few women in this room right now that actually work in the private sector. So we should be thinking about engaging them actually in these conversations. We've had 2 great speakers, but no offense, this is a big room of white men. And so while these statistics are great, I think what we really need to be talking about is what is the barrier, or what are the barriers for women moving into the sector. We see, in the US, 50% of people being graduated in STEM are women, but there's not 50% women moving into careers in that area. And so we should really be talking about and educating people in this room why that gap exists. There's a lot of evidence out there, there's a lot of statistics, there's a lot of analysis on what that is, and to me that's what we really should be talking about and how to overcome that. Yeah. And it's simple things. It's called maternity leave, paternity leave, childcare, but just comments. Did that spur anybody to say something? Yes.
As someone who's been in this sector and actually moved from serving utility clients, that's where the diversity issue is a much bigger question, and we're way more behind than we are in renewables. I think a lot of the issues is that renewables is often attracting people who already have experience in the energy sector, and there's very few entry-level jobs for people who are coming out of college and are excited to contribute new ideas to this, to private companies in this sector. And I think that's where I see you getting a lot of the demographics that were prevalent in the traditional energy industry. So if, at our own companies, I think there should be a bigger push to open up entry-level positions and train people up and make that mentorship investment that is really needed.
Yeah, just a quick comment on what you're saying, and I think it's an excellent point. I think it's, when we talk about energy, so it's twofold, and so on the centralized energy, I think you're correct. I mean, from a private sector perspective, these are, especially in the US, these are large companies, and the discussion about gender, and it's not just gender, it's about gender diversity inclusion. I just couldn't master the time of figuring out how to get all of that data in these little slides. But these are the themes that should be discussed, and these are themes that are discussed mainly in the larger companies, in the multinational companies, for a lot of different reasons, because there's a first, like I was mentioning on the data points, there's a huge market for women, there's a huge potential to see that there's a huge demand that is not met today. So multinationals do that in the centralized. In renewable energy, in what is off-grid, we see that more and more happening, especially on the terms of the implementation and specifically in developing countries. But you are correct. I think there needs to be more. And I don't know if we will solve this as us here in this room today during our work life, but I think the more these discussions happen, like I was mentioning about the UK, about just having the data out there, the more this will become norm, but it takes time. So this is a little bit what I would take on this. And
And we've got 2 more questions or points, or actually 3. We'll go to Santiago, David, and then this.
Thank you. So a couple years ago, we, as part of the CEADIR activity, we conducted an energy assessment in Mexico, and we looked at gender aspects or linkages with the energy sector. And it was, worrying to find that there was practically nothing on gender and energy in place. And this was at all levels, at the policy level, in the firms, et cetera. And so my question, I wanted to see if you have any sort of suggestions, are there any tools available that you know that are very good, for example, in terms of setting priorities, right? Like, what are the key issues that people should be looking at in the private sector or in the public sector when developing policies? Are there specific topics? For example, the government was trying to support scholarships for renewable energy fields. So that seemed like a very good opportunity to incorporate gender criteria. But are there others from your perspective that should be particularly encouraged?
Before you answer it, let's get a couple more questions out there. We can take them as a group. So David, please jump in with your question or point. You can just start talking. I think it'll go on.
Hello. David Speer from Deloitte Consulting. I think it's a really important topic, and I'm glad we're talking about it. Just one, I think with respect to renewable energy, I think there's a lot of opportunity. I think the utilities, in the discussion today, the public sector utilities in developing countries have a lot, they're at the forefront of integrating renewable energy. Of course, it's tremendous in the off-grid space, but a lot of today is about in the utility scale space, and I think that I think more can be done and should be done to encourage utilities to be more gender balanced in their own staffing, and when we're providing consulting and technical assistance to them, I think donor partners and banks have the opportunity to make sure that to use that opportunity potentially to leverage and look for making sure that the utilities that they're serving, are establishing targets for gender balance in their workforce and for gender participation in events. I know that USAID is doing a lot of that, and I think there even more can be done. And as consulting firms, I think that we can make sure that the teams that we lead by example, that we walk the talk, and that the teams that we're putting in front of the very same clients and counterparts that we want to change and evolve their behavior, that our teams look gender balanced as well.
That's great. Can we take a couple more? Because I've got a few in the queue and I want to make sure we get to them. Sure. We'll go here, and then Suzanne, and then John.
Hi, I'm Cindy Chia. I'm right now a student. In this forum throughout today, we have talked about potentially mini-grids or microgrids will be very important in the future, particularly in a lot of emerging economies. So I'm wondering whether in your observations, when a mini-grid is set up in the community, whether one gender or another has a priority or tends to be the one who end up in the decision-making group, and whether with the proliferation of mini-grids in the future, is that going to shift the power balance? Thank you.
Suzanne, do you want to jump in here? We'll take Suzanne and then John, and then would love your comments on these.
So first off, I have to make a comment and then actually leave the room to go to a different conference, so I apologize in advance. Just a couple comments. So for those of you that aren't aware, the National Solar Energy Industries Association, CEA, has they've actually they've changed the structure so that it's inclusive of diversity more broadly than just gender diversity. But it started off as a women's initiative that I chaired. And so the main outcome, I would say, out of a year's worth of focus there was a report that the Solar Foundation published that I helped and others helped fundraise for, that identifies, that essentially surveyed it. So for those of you that aren't aware, the Solar Foundation does a broader national census of the solar industry that includes very small companies, local sales and installation companies, as well as some of the largest players, like SunPower for solar, et cetera. And the foundation took that same census approach and applied it and asked some additional questions focused on diversity in the industry. And it had some really valuable insights, both in terms of problems with respect to diversity, both pay, levels of leadership, et cetera, and also very specific suggestions for improvement. So I thought I was really pleased because it provides a baseline for very specific strategies that are not just applicable to the solar industry. It just happens to be a solar industry report. Moving forward, I'm optimistic that that work will be incorporated into the annual solar census work. And then ideally, that foundation will work with the Wind Energy Foundation together to do a wind and solar census that would then include that diversity-related census. So that would be, from my perspective, at least as far as the United States goes, a really great process moving forward. And I think for those of you that aren't familiar with it, I would really recommend you take a look. And then finally, one other comment would be that in the States, and I know this is a global forum, but there's just a couple of specific examples that are US focused that I think could be applicable elsewhere, or are applicable elsewhere. In the States, there's an organization it started as Women of Wind Energy, WOWI, and then they rebranded and changed their area of emphasis, so it's RISE. I think it stands for, someone will probably correct me, it's Women of Renewable and Sustainable Energy, something like that. And it has a full-time executive director, and it's a great organization that is an excellent resource. So if you are a consulting firm or in the industry or with a utility, you can work with that organization and support that organization. And they provide, they work with others like CEA, et cetera, to provide very specific strategies for improvement. And then one other comment is that within SunPower, we have our own team for diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's basically an internal grassroots effort. And it doesn't really matter the scale of the organization that you work for, but I would really recommend establishing an internal support structure within the company that has very specific goals and timelines. It's not that difficult, right? And that's what I would recommend. And thank you for all the men that actually came back from lunch and are here. So, we need men to be in the conversation, so I'm glad there's so many men in the room.
Yeah. John, one more comment, and then we'll have a last minute comments from you, and then we'll move right into the next session. So thank you.
Yeah, I'm John Rizayan, just for setting the stage. I was born and raised in Iran and have been here for the last 40 years. So I think to look at the gender issue, you really have to emphasize education. With all the things that we hear, even today, about negative things we hear, there are more, 98%, last time I checked, 98% of the Iranian women are educated. If you look at the parliament, there are parliamentarians. If you look at the ministers, there are Iranian ministers. If you look at higher education, we had the higher education was being run by Iranian women, all the universities. And there is equal opportunity for ladies to do whatever they want, even though they have to cover their hair. So that's the only limitation today. So I think if you want to have equality, you got to have emphasis on education and emphasis on independence. So you have to create independent women who can talk for themselves instead of having somebody else to talk for them. They have to have independent women who can ask for the money that they're worth it. And you have to have independent women who claim what they own or what they deserve. So that's really the crux of having equality.
Thank you, John. Would you ladies like to take 5 minutes and provide your closing takeaways?
Sure.
Thanks.
Sure.
So I guess to the point that Santiago's question about resources, I would just say on the public sector side of things, through the Clean Energy Solutions Center, we do have a team of experts that are focused on gender issues. So in the event you're working with government partners or you're engaging with them through forums, we can provide that service at no cost. It's funded by our sponsors. And then we also have online like a blueprint for gender and energy access policy and policy examples. So those could be useful. And I would just add my own perspective as someone who's like kind of early-ish career. I think one of the most valuable things we could do here in the US are just more like mentorship programs. I think that could be, it doesn't have to be along gender lines, but I think that would be really valuable.
Yeah, thank you. Just to briefly go, because I know we don't have a lot of time, and to just a touch point on the comments and the question, and I really welcome the candidness of this. I mean, this is an interesting topic, a challenging topic, but it's also a fun topic to try to figure out and work together, everybody, to figure out what we can do about it. And I think that definitely education is key. There are other questions that have been raised, for example, on how to connect in the business perspective women, right? So, for instance, the multinational companies, there are specific sort of quotas that they self-impose themselves in exactly for what I was mentioning from a business perspective, to increase their bottom line, to prioritize getting small, medium-sized women-owned companies, or a certain that has certain quotas of women in it, to provide some of the equipment, the materials. So there are a lot of different resources, a lot of different programs. One of them, just as an example, is We Connect, that is with multinationals, with multilaterals. It's a huge program that has a lot of support on that. And another one, you know, just to put women at the different levels, there are quotas in a lot of companies. So for companies that want to do just to talk what they want to really believe in, there are quotas, and quotas for good or bad, they have a purpose, at least for some part of the generations. It is important because, again, from the business perspective, it does make sense to attend to the whole population. And finally, with respect to the question of Cindy on mini-grids, I think that when gender, I mean, mini-grids is one of the means of providing electricity. It could be just solar house systems, and there's a lot of different types of other means. And it really depends on the country, on the local community, on its engagement, on engaging the women. So definitely correlating that with education and ensuring that when, for example, who is providing the mini-grid? What is that company? Is it a foreign company, a local company? They're the ones that have to sort of be mentored so that they include the gender component in their dialogue, so as to train both men and women in this type of program, for example, implementing a mini-grid. So I think we ran out of questions, but thank you very much. No, not out of questions. We ran out of time, but thank you so much. And I think the point of also having this maybe on a next seminar, like maybe at 8 a.m. for breakfast might be a better option, or during the day is an excellent point. So thank you very much. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Bethany.
Thanks. Let's give them a round of applause. Thanks, everyone, for the discussion.